Well, as I said, it's our pleasure to have these two special guests with us tonight, authors Craig and Paula Harline, and I'll just tell you a little bit about them, and we'll have, I was going to say we'll have the priesthood speak first. Craig will speak to us first, and then Paula will get the last word. But Craig, I just now recently, in recent days, became aware of a couple of the books that he's written, one called Conversions, two family stories from the Reformation and modern America. We have some copies of that available. He also did a book called Sunday, A History of the First Day, from Babylonia to the Super Bowl. Aren't they the same thing? And then, of course, his newest book, Way Below the Angels, the pretty clearly troubled, but not even close to tragic confessions of a real live Mormon missionary, published by William Erdmans. I'm reading this now, and I'll have to say that we have a few things in common, at least, as you read the book, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about it, but he was, of course, this was just a few years ago when you got your mission call, like me too, although I went before you did. I guess we were both kind of dreading getting a call to the States, to the United States. I actually had nightmares about going to the States, literally. And I just wanted to go to a foreign country, become fluent in a language, and of course, convert somebody famous and all that. And so back in the day, when I went, you didn't have, what'd you say, 300 people gathered for the opening of the call. I literally ran from KSL, and by the way, I want to welcome Doug and Dee Wright. Doug from KSL here tonight is a good friend. They're both good friends and loyal customers, which is the most important, of course. I ran from the old KSL location on Social Hall Avenue to the church office building so I could pick up my call early so it didn't go through the mail. Come on in, folks. We have a door open back there if you, it might be a little easier. And so I got the call from them, and I tore it open and read Alabama, Florida. Alabama, Florida? Isn't that in the States? And, well, they don't think it's in the States, it's in the Confederacy, but that's a whole other story. So I was really disappointed, and had to work through that, and then they were trying to make me feel better there, and they said, oh, Hartman Rector's the new mission president there, you'll love it, he's great, and I went, okay, well, maybe. But so I reconciled all that, had a great mission, did get to learn a new foreign language. I learned how to talk Southern, and didn't have to go to the LTM like Craig did, but I did pick up Southern, and had a great experience. But he also didn't want to go to the States, and he tells that story in the book, and ended up going to Belgium, which is not in the States either. Craig, so he authored the books that I mentioned. The Conversions book was named one of 2011's top 10 books in religion by Publishers Weekly, which is kind of a big deal. And he teaches European history at Brigham Young University, which is also in the States. Although that's a whole other issue in my neighborhood. They would prefer that it be in another state, since the U is the true university in my neighborhood. Paula has been teaching writing, college writing, for over 20 years for the University of Idaho, BYU, and BYU in Provo, right? Not Idaho, and Utah Valley University, and has worked as a freelance writer and artist. And her book, of course, is the Polygamous Wives Writing Club, which I remember when it was first announced, I thought, well, that's a really fascinating title. I wonder what the approach is. And Of course, the subtitle from the Diaries of Mormon Pioneer Women. And this is published by Oxford University Press. Both of those are a big deal, by the way, to get. In fact, I was amazed that Erdman's, who is a religious publisher, I was surprised that they published a Mormon-related book. Things have progressed a long way, I think. Now, I have to tell you, I got quite a kick out of the announcement in the paper today, in the Trib, about tonight's signing, that Paul and Craig Harline would be discussing their books. So, not only would Craig have a lot of answering to do about a beard, teaching at BYU, but why he is having this thing with his spouse, Paul. So, in the body of the ad, it does say Paul, I have to say. But when they told me about this today, I got a real kick out of that. So, yeah, we like to have fun here as well as talk about serious books. But I want you to hear them, and so that's all I have for now. And then after they're done speaking about their books, then we'll have the Q&A, and then we'd invite you to come and purchase some books. So I'll now turn the time over to Craig.
Passing the mic.
Yes, this is sort of like the mantle of the prophet, but not exactly. Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Sure. Well, thanks a lot for being here. I think we decided that I would go first because I think I get the sense that most of the questions are going to come from Paula. I have no doubt. Much harder questions, too. I think one of the other things that we have in common, besides that we're married and have children together, is that we both ended up writing a book that came out at about the same time about iconic figures of Mormonism, right? I mean, there aren't too many more iconic figures than the white-shirted male missionary and the polygamous wife, right? So I think we do have this in common, and it is interesting, I think, that they just happened to come out at the same time. We didn't really plan it that way, but that's just sort of how it emerged. And so again, I'm glad to be able to talk about it. When I was about 25 years old, I started having a dream that I had to go on another mission. And it was a terrifying dream. I'd been home from a mission for about 4 years. And I'd wake up in a sweat, and I started having it after I got married, so I don't know if it was related to that or not, Paula, but anyway, I was terrified in this dream that I had to go again. Sometimes I had to go alone. Sometimes I was young again, 19 again. Sometimes I had to go with my whole family, but I was the only one who had to do all the work. And it would just come in so many variations and so often. And I did not know what to make of this, because I never heard anybody talk about this in all the missionary homecomings that I'd heard in my life, or the missionary farewells. It was always full of heroic stories. Nobody had ever mentioned a dream like this. So, of course, I assumed I was the only one who had a dream like this. So I was really embarrassed about it. I was even ashamed about it, because I thought, if you'd really been a good missionary, how in the world could you possibly have a dream like this? Right? I mean, especially, I was completely aware that I knew I'd gotten a lot of good things out of going on a mission too. So I was ashamed, embarrassed, all the negative adjectives you want to think of. And so I think one of the reasons, or right away, I wanted to write about this. And I thought, I obviously need to sort something out here. And I thought writing about it would be a good thing to do. But in the meantime, I was getting a PhD in history and studying European religious history, which had a lot to do with my having gone on a mission to Belgium. And so I started writing books on those subjects, some of which he mentioned tonight. And though I kept putting off, writing the book about the mission, which I really wanted to write for a long time. Then, when I wrote my last book, called Conversions, which he just showed you, that involved two stories, one from the 17th century and one from the 1970s. And it was about one of my friends, and it was about me, and it was about Mormons, as well as about the 17th century Catholics and Protestants. And the theme of the book was about how conversion affects family relationships. And one of the things I was trying to show was that those dynamics and those challenges are very similar in the 17th century as in the 20th century. I was trying to show that there's real immediacy in the 17th century, in the 8th century, whatever. There's always some connection to our lives right now that we can find in life in the past. So anyway, I wanted to make that connection more explicit, and that's how I got involved in putting myself into the book, which historians never do or aren't supposed to do or whatever, but I did it anyway. And making a book that personal was terribly frightening, and also there was something liberating about it. Because I felt like at last I could say what I really think a 17th century story means. Most of the time I labor, studying obscure people, and people really want to know, you study these kinds of things? What can those old people possibly have to, tell us? And I've got so many social events and embarrassments I can't even begin to tell those stories. But anyway, I wanted to say what I thought the 17th century had to do with life right now. So that made it really personal. Well, once I wrote that, then it seemed like, I really should be writing about conversion of my own sense of being a missionary. Writing the book Conversions about family relationships, that was a pretty natural book or topic for anybody who's ever been on a mission. And you realize almost nobody ever converts in any religion all by themselves or with a whole family. There's always somebody who gets upset. And so, you're a first-hand witness to that when you're a missionary. And anyway, so I wanted to write now, this time from the other side, and I thought maybe it's finally time to write my mission book. I also thought that because I began to see there were other mission books beginning to emerge. I think it was something in the zeitgeist, since the advent of the internet and the increasing maybe forced honesty in all cultures, including LDS culture, right? There's so much more information available. There's this new openness about history. There's maybe also a new openness about our faith experiences. And I thought, maybe some other people might be interested in this as well, if there are other people already starting to write about their missions in this kind of frank way. Now, there had long been books about missions, but they'd been dominated by people who wrote these really pious accounts from within the church for other church members, or by people who had become disaffected and left and wrote these really scandalous exposés, right? There's the David Fales, I think, did the Broadway series Missionary Position or something like this, some scandalous kind of thing. He'd been on a mission himself. And I wasn't denying that those stories weren't real for the people who experienced them, right? I mean, there could be the really ideal mission, there could be the really horrible experience mission. But my sense in talking to missionaries over a lot of years was that there were a lot more people like me, somewhere in the middle, who still, pretty much, they're hanging on, but they also need to make sense of what happened on their mission. So I started talking to people. Even in my 20s, I'm sure I talked to people about their missions. We found some common experiences and so on. But after about 10 or 15 years of talking, I can't remember exactly when, I finally got brave enough to start asking people whether they'd had this dream too. And it turned out to be really common. And not everybody had it. Some people had no clue what I was talking about. But plenty of people, a majority of the people that I talked to knew exactly what I was talking about. And it was always, I thought I was the only one who had that dream. And one of my friends who's 60 years old, he's left the church maybe 15 years ago, he says, I thought I was the only one having that dream. And I thought it was my own private struggle that I had to deal with. And I said, no, this is part of the collective unconscious. This is something going on with a lot of missionaries. And the interesting thing with him was, another crucial part of the dream is that he says, I always agree to go. Even though I've been out of the church for 15 years and don't believe in anything anymore, I always agree to go on the other mission. So that, there are so many aspects of this dream that really a psychologist needs to take apart. But to me, it was interesting enough that it just happened at all. And so I thought, with that kind of going on, I think this is a book that maybe other people would be interested in. And I know, there were some others that were beginning to emerge, but to me, they still felt like they were either kind of for Mormons or for people who weren't Mormon, and I wanted to write it for both audiences. So that kind of brings up, I guess, my third and final point, which is that I really did want to write this for non-LDS people as well. And at first I couldn't articulate why, but I think what I came up with at first was that I wanted to show that missionaries were human, I suppose. I also wanted to show that to other Mormons. I think Mormons tend to romanticize missionaries, especially those who haven't been on missions, and outsiders tend to, stereotype them as well. They're angel, they're robots, or they're sinister, or they're automatons, whatever. And I just felt like, my favorite books are those that humanize people, whether they're from another religion, another culture, or whatever. That it helps me to see. They help me to see myself in them, and vice versa. And I thought, I think this kind of story, even though it seems terribly idiosyncratic and terribly Mormon, I also thought this was this kind of story that could be something that other people could relate to, people of other faiths or no faith. So that was one reason I wanted to publish it with somebody kind of outside the Mormon cultural corridor. I figured Mormons would find it if they're interested, but if I published it with someone like Erdman's, there'd be a built-in kind of evangelical Christian audience as well. And I approached them because they had published 2 books about Mormons in the last 7 or 8 years that were pretty sympathetic, and I thought, maybe they would be interested in something like this as well. So I sent it to them, and the editor wrote me back like within a few days, and he said he had never laughed so hard about any book that had ever crossed his desk at Erdman's. Go ahead, Mom. Come in and interrupt me. Don't worry. Janet, go ahead. Thank you for coming. Anyway, he told me how much he had laughed about this, but I didn't take that as much of a compliment coming from Erdman's with all the serious theological books they published. So I didn't know if that was still the case. But then I met a lot of the other people on the staff, and they tended to be people in their 20s and 30s, the internet marketing team and things like this. And they were all young evangelicals, and they all said how much they could relate to it as well. So I was glad that it confirmed my suspicion that there was something that they could find in it, that they could recognize them in themselves. I think the main theme that I hope comes, or that I was interested in, that I wanted to explore, and maybe even the cause of the dream, was this gap between prescription and practice. And I'm interested in that in religious history anyway. That's what I study. Whether I study the Reformation or not, I'm interested in what are the ideals of a religion or of a society, and then what do people actually do. And if you're a historian, you know that they never mesh up. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have ideals. It just means that it's a question of how you relate to those ideals. And therefore, I think with this dream thing, I think the reason, or one of the big causes behind it, wasn't so much where you went on a mission, because I talked to people who converted, all kinds of people who still had this dream, and other people who went to missions like mine where you converted basically no one, and they didn't have the dream. I think it has a lot to do with your personality and your expectations. And the higher you, or let me go back to more, the more you believe that you can achieve the ideals, maybe the stronger your sense of failure when you don't. And I think that's kind of the cause of a lot of our, and we have dreams about a lot of things, anything that's really hard, more serious things like war, or things like school, or whatever. There are all kinds of things that we have dreams about. Everybody has the dream you forgot to take a class, or you forgot to go to class. So there's that as well. But this one was especially frightening to me just because it's so tied up with your religious sensibilities, right? And your sense of salvation and goodness and so on. So I think that's why I wanted to solve it. But I think that's the broad appeal, whether you're LDS or not LDS, is that everybody strives to achieve some kind of ideal. And how do you deal with it when you don't? And I think trying to reconcile the difference between ideal and practice is part of growing up. It's just part of maturing as a human being in whatever culture you live in. I think what makes it especially difficult for Mormon missionaries is often that the ideal is perceived as the only reality. And that it depends, of course, on what mission you're in and so on. And it depends on how you perceive things as well. Again, your personality comes into play. But it's almost as if you say that you can't reach the ideal, that you're denying the faith or something like this. That's how I felt anyway. So I think that's what makes it, what made it particularly difficult, was the sense that, you cannot say, here's reality and here's the ideal. You have to accept the ideal as reality. The ideal is your only reality. Anything less than that, you just have not enough faith, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's the main theme that I hope would appeal. And I think sorting it out, writing through it, working through the story, made me feel like it helped me solve the dream. But I think it also helped me feel like I could relate better to other believers than I could by talking about theology. I think there are people who are really good talking about theology, and that's often how we try to approach interfaith discussions, is say, what do we have in common? What are the differences, right? When you're on a mission, everybody wants to know, what are the differences? And you get expert at answering those questions. But what I found for me is that I feel like I best understand people in other religions when we talk about our experiences, and warts and all experiences, what you like and what you don't like. And then you begin to see, wow, we really do have a lot in common. We both struggle with this tension between prescription and practice, right? And so to me, talking about intra-faith experience does more to promote interfaith relations than talking about theology does, but that's me. There are other people who are really good at that. And so I think this is the contribution I try to make with this book, is to really go into detail. And the most ironic thing to me was the more I dug inside, the more universal the story became. That was not what I expected. I somehow thought that if I try to find the common denominators that are visible and so on, but no, as the more I dug inside, that people would really respond and say, I felt that too, and I thought I was the only one who felt that. And then this happens over and over again. That was really the most interesting, I think, part to me, is that the more you admit inside, the more you're relating really to other people. I hadn't expected that at all. Anyway, those are the things I wanted to say. I'll let Paula.
Yeah, we better let you do that. I might get slapped.
Thank you for inviting us here tonight, and I'm Paula Harline. In the 1980s, when I was in graduate school, I was particularly excited about women's studies. I was excited about the prospects of rescuing texts that had been written by women and ignored for decades or centuries. I was excited about feminist criticism, and given my own faith tradition, I was excited about Mormon women's history. And in particular, I loved reading the publications that came out about the great heritage that I had of independent women. Many of them were feminists from the 19th century who were politically involved, who, with their sisters of the same husband, helped each other have greater opportunities, shared childcare, were somewhat independent from their husbands, had jobs that they could do and opportunities that they could take for education because they were polygamous wives. And I ended up studying that more as a graduate student, and then after graduate school continued to be interested in the topic, and so I ended up collecting 29 autobiographies and diaries written by Mormon polygamous wives who were married between 1850 and 1890, who did not flee to Canada or Mexico during the federal polygamy raids, who were not married to general authorities, nor were they general women leaders themselves. And of course, they had to write their own story. I wanted to study obscure women to see if they had the same kind of experiences that I had read about more famous women. So I came up with, as I said, with my criteria, 29 documents, and I was excited to read about women on the country roads of polygamy, as I would call it. My study is sort of specialized because it looks at their personal writings. So that, and I say this in the book, that should not probably be taken as the end of the story. I think it's interesting, since I'm a diarist myself and I like to write, I think it's interesting to see what they felt at a particular moment, at a particular time, under a particular circumstance. And of the 29, about half of them kept diaries or journals, which you could imagine would be more immediate and have very fascinating details about what had happened that day or what had happened recently. About half of them are autobiographies, so they have the perspective of looking back over their lives and seeing how things had worked out for them. So in the process of reading these autobiographies and diaries closely, although even in that period of time, women married in that 40 years, although you should be able to get your hands around it, it's very complex. And polygamy is not just one story, it's many stories. I have structured the book into 3 parts. And I thought I would just briefly tell you what my 3 overriding themes or findings are and read you some brief excerpts from some of the wives' diaries and autobiographies. So first off, I noticed that Craig just spoke about the ideal and the reality. I noticed that although they believed in polygamy and had become polygamous wives, they had a hard time shrugging off the ideal of monogamy. So it seemed to me that the whole time they're married, speaking in general, they focused on the monogamous marriage between themselves and their husbands, and not so much like the polygamous relationships between, another wife or other wives. And of course, this seemed quite honest and real to me as I was read about it, because I think having the ideal of monogamous marriage as I do, their feelings seemed very similar to the kinds of feelings that I would have if I were in their situation. And I just picked out 3 first wives, and I'll just read you just short excerpts of some of the things that they wrote. This is from 1889, Emma Nielsen, St. George. After I got my precious little ones in bed, I took a walk in the moonlight, all the while wondering where my husband, my precious FG, was. A sweet response would be that he's in Arizona doing his duty to his other family, but then I often wonder if he is doing his duty to his family here in St. George. How pleased I would be if he would step in and minister to our wants, soothe the cries of my 4 little ones, and do a father's part. They have looked forward to the time so long that they would see their pa, that they begin to think they have no pa. I feel broken-hearted myself. My heart is so sore, and who in all this world can heal it except my dear FG? One word from his precious lips at this moment could do it. I love him as I do my own life, and when can I linger by his side as I once used to? Here's another polygamous wife whose husband was taken into custody and jailed, and she was trying to go see him and bringing her little children to try to go meet him. Elizabeth explained, and this is Elizabeth MacDonald in Provo. In these trying times, I went twice to Provo to see my husband in jail, but was not permitted to see him. I cannot describe the painful feelings I had under these trying circumstances. The last morning I went to Provo, even my little children said, "Ma, put the gun and pistol in the wagon and we will bring Pa home." My feelings were so overpowered that I could not talk to the children once that she had tried to see him and they wouldn't let her in. And then one more. She explains that when her husband was called as a bishop, a couple of years later, I think he was pressured to take another wife, and he decided to marry the girl who had been working in their house, helping her after the birth of her 7th baby. And she said, in January 1888, my daughter Eliza Jane was born, a beautiful black-eyed girl Vina was helping at our home at the time, and with my consent, David decided to go to St. George and make her his wife. With my help in preparing her clothes, for she had no experience in that line, she was ready to take the trip with my husband. When David and Vina returned from being married in St. George, Lydia struggled to adjust. She wrote, "I tried to be a mother and sister to her, but oh, it was hard. Many nights my pillow would be wet with grief. I had 7 children when she came into the family and had 7 afterward. I was only human, though I knew that principle, plural marriage, had been revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith, and that it was true and sacred. It was almost more than I could endure. It came nearly taking my life." So the second or middle portion of the book focuses on my original interest, which was how did the women get along with each other? And as I said, I was curious to see if they would bond together, what those relationships were like. And I loved Martha Cox's story about her sister wives. I don't know if you've heard of her before, but Martha Cox loved her sister wives. There's a picture in here of her with her 2 sister wives, as she called them. And I'm quoting in and out from her, but this is how I wrote about it. She began to learn the family's routine, perfect obedience, and to speak no words when angry. She learned to get up at 5, which she found difficult. At 9 at night, the curfew sounded, and she would toss sleeplessly there till near the middle of the night. She learned that the family didn't eat much meat, drink tea, or use salt in their salt-risen bread. Martha would explain that the first year of her married life gave her more experience in the duties of life than she had ever had before. In their residence, the 1880 census taker found Isaiah Cox, age 43, and 3 wives, Henny, 44, Elizabeth, 32, and Martha, 28, and 14 children between the ages of 1 and 21. 3 of the 4 adults, Isaiah, Elizabeth, and Martha, descended from Kentucky stock. Martha came to love living there. The 3 wives' work was so systemized and so well ordered that they could with ease do a great deal. First thing in the morning, one would superintend the cooking and kitchen work, one would make the beds and sweep, and another would comb and wash all the children. At 7:30, they all sat down to breakfast. The second wife was the dressmaker, the best saleswoman, and generally did most of the buying, especially the shoes, because she was a good judge of leather. The first wife did all the mending and darning, but never ironed. Martha did most of that. On wash day, all hands were employed except the cook. The 3 wives usually never went out together, even to church, because one always stayed home and took care of the children and the house. They even shared baby clothes and maternity clothes and helped each other during childbirth. However, in the autobiographies and diaries that I read, her story is exceptional. Number one, because they lived together, because a lot of the wives moved out into their own houses, especially after they had children. But also because she loved her sister wives so much and because they were such good friends. This is an interesting story. Laura Thurber wrote that she really liked the younger wife, who was a younger girl. She was about 18 years old and Laura was in her 20s. And when their husband went to prison, Laura was hoping that Annie would stay there with her. And she wrote, "Oh, I dread sickness when my husband is not here and I have to stay alone of nights and so much outdoors chores to be done. Laura wished that Annie would stay with her more often." She wrote, "It seems very queer not to have her come here." Another time Laura wrote that she didn't know how long Annie will stay with me because she gets very lonesome, and I do too, since Joseph left. It is a great trial to Annie to be deprived of their husband's company so much. So even though Laura wanted her to stay there, her mom left. The second wife, Annie, left and went home to her own family when their husband wasn't there. And then finally, I thought this was curious. Ellen Draper was the youngest of 3 wives, and she wrote at the end of her short autobiography, "Well, I must say what I think about polygamy. I went into it in 1862, and no one's ever heard me say I did not think the principle was true. I know in my heart it is, but it was abused, and that's why it was allowed to be put down." She went on to say that she knew of polygamous families that were just as happy in polygamy as in monogamy. And then she mentioned one, a family by the name of Decker. Ellen said she had visited with the older Decker wife many times, and the woman always had good to say about the younger wives who allowed her to sit in her room and sew or knit. But I thought it was curious that she didn't tell any stories from her own marriage with the other wives in her family. And they had been together a few years before they separated after their husband died, and they each went their own ways. So that's the middle of the book. It's kind of looking closely at sisterhood. And then the third part of the book is about something that I found very fascinating, and that is the decade of the 1880s, when there was lots of persecution against polygamous families by the federal government. And that was a very difficult time for polygamous wives. And they knew they were making sacrifices, they knew their lives were hard, and I think they wanted to write it down so that their families wouldn't forget about it. This is from Aggie McAllister, who had to be married secretly at night in the St. George Temple. After they were married, they left the St. George Temple separately that night, and the newlyweds were so afraid of being caught that they didn't spend their first night together, but they did meet a block away from the temple near an old house with large tamarack trees in front. Joseph said he couldn't go home without seeing her again. Aggie was crying, and he asked why. She told him, "I don't know. I suppose everyone cries, leaving their dear old name for a new one." In her autobiography, she would confess, "Pa," her husband Joseph, "didn't stay the first night, and I always felt hurt about it." When she got home, her sister Aggie hunched by the stove, and her sister said, "Same old hunch," as though nothing had changed. Aggie was only beginning what would be years of secret living. Her husband rented a room for her, and her sisters helped move her trunk and bed there. She explained, "We didn't dare ask anyone to take my things for fear they would know." And two more examples. This is from Lorena Larson. She had to leave her hometown and assume another name and go to a new town where no one would know her. So she went to Redmond, Utah, as she wrote about her husband, "supposed there was no one in that place who knew us," she wrote. To keep their identity secret, Lorena renamed herself Hannah Thompson, and she taught her children to call their father Uncle Thompson when he visited. Her 2-year-old Lottie got confused and asked, "Is my daddy my uncle?" Despite her efforts to hide their identity in Redmond, Lorena was taken back when a neighbor woman, Anna Breinholt, recognized her because they both had a sister married to the same man. Lorena told her not to tell a living soul who she was because her husband's safety from the pen depended on it. Lorena and Anna Breinholt became cautious friends. Lorena and her children had to keep away from public places, so they didn't even attend church. On Sundays, they had their own little family Sunday school. Lorena also spent many hours with her children on a grass knoll near a small spring that made a waterfall. The children tried to catch the fish there with their hands while Lorena crocheted tidies and lace. And finally, this is Olive Potter, a second wife who, by the way, the first wives were pretty safe in the 1880s because they weren't doing anything wrong. It was the additional wives who had to make themselves scarce. And so she wrote that they moved out into the country to get away from the polygamy raids, but one of her husband's sons came running to her to warn her that the marshal was coming. So she put her oldest daughter, Pearl, on her back and her second daughter, Myrtle, in her arms, and she was pregnant. And she wrote, I ran as fast as I could through fields and brush to some people I knew. She stayed there a week, shared the only room in the house with the people, and had to sleep on a dirt floor. She was up all the time with her baby so they wouldn't disturb the people she was staying with, and she had a miscarriage 2 months along from the dashing run. She felt awkward taking the people's food because they were very poor, and she couldn't eat what they did have on account of the flies. She thought her stomach would turn inside out. So that gives you an idea of the three main themes that I found and tried to concentrate on. And I guess I felt good that since that time when I was in graduate school, I was finally able to bring forth obscure and ignored texts and try to make these women's stories available and known to more people. So.
Why don't you both stand up there and answer questions, if you would.
Any questions?
Craig, do you still have the dream?
No, not really, but some people have written me and said they stopped having it until they read my book, and then they had it again. But one fellow wrote me and said it was very therapeutic and helped the dream go in a new direction. So it went in a whole different direction. So, you know, I figured if you're still having it, you got stuff you haven't processed.
I have a question about, you got to tell us about the title of your book, Paula. Where did that come from?
I wanted to emphasize that these were stories written, you know, the women had written their own stories, and I was trying to draw on those stories. So I called it the Polygamous Wives Writing Club because when I actually took the 29 women's lives, the 29 women, and mapped them out, like the years they lived in certain places, I was able to figure out that 2 or 3 clusters of them would have lived actually factually near each other at around the same time. And so I wanted to imagine, sort of as a writing device, that they could have known each other, or they could have gotten together to share their writings. Although I don't pretend they do, but that's a way for me to present them, that they may have gotten together to share what they had written with each other, and this is what they wrote, and what they would have in common. Yes, it wasn't unheard of for women to do that, to share their writing or to get together and write together. And also, my mother-in-law, and we lived in the same ward for many years, and she was part of a writing club in the Relief Society that would meet once a month, and that sort of stimulated my imagination that Relief Society sisters might get together and share their writings.
And they were all polygamous, right?
Did you, how many people did you interview for your book on the missionaries?
Did I interview?
Yeah.
I
did. You
did.
draw from?
I talked to a lot of my friends about their experiences. I didn't really interview anybody who was on my mission. I changed all the names. So I just, over the years, I'm sure I've talked to 1,000 people, you know, asking them questions, what kind of experiences they've had and so on, and they had the dream, and yeah. So it was kind of informal. It wasn't really serious research, but yeah, it was helped me get a sense that I felt like, yeah, I was tapping into something common.
Do you want to go next?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Could I have a couple of short questions. Did you do the artwork on the dust cover?
No, Oxford, I recommended some cover ideas to them. They asked me to.
Cool.
And they actually paid the Rockefeller Folk Art Museum to be able to use this 19th century painting that's at the Folk Art Museum in Virginia, I believe it is.
Okay, the second short one is, I know that you have used the writings of Martha Spence Haywood in your book, and I'm just interested in your impressions, your basic impressions of her.
Martha Spence Haywood came to Utah, I think, 1850, and was surprised that the man who invited her to board with his family proposed to her, and she married him. She was a little older than he was, as far as I can research it. And not long after their marriage, she went to help settle the town that would become Nephi, and then she later went to St. George and became a legendary school teacher. But the diaries that are available, thanks to Juanita Brooks, who edited her diaries, and thanks to the I was going to say PA, but during the 1930s, they rescued her diary that was especially from the mid-1850s, well, the early 1850s. And she's remarkably literary and frank, and yeah, her husband at one point didn't want her to write anymore because he knew that she was writing things, but you know, she like most people are kind of conflicted about their experience. She wrote that she was grateful because she called herself a spinster. She came across the plains and I think she was 39 years old, and so she had an opportunity to marry and to have children, and she said after all those years of not belonging to anyone, not feeling like she had a family, she did have a family, and at the same time she had her ups and downs, you know, in the house she lived in with his family before she went on her own, and then after that. So
Okay.
I loved what she wrote.
Thank you, me too.
Are you related to her?
No, I'm not, but I'm from the area.
Okay.
The Nephites.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they had a hard time, those early Nephi settlers. Yes?
When you're reading through the diaries, did you ever find that when you were reading them, you thought that maybe they didn't really think anyone would ever read this again? Was it, you know, how much did you get the feeling that they were writing to an audience and writing to themselves?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because sometimes you can tell they're coaching themselves, like they're using their diary like I might, you know, to write my problems, my concerns, trying to sort things out, and then they end up trying to encourage themselves to try harder. They write mistakes they think they made or problems they have. And then, of course, autobiographies could be more obviously directed maybe to their ancestors or to their descendants to let them know what they felt and what they experienced. And I had the impression many times that they didn't want to be forgotten. And I think we all feel that way when we have struggled through something really difficult. We kind of want other people to know that we went through that and what it made of us and what we became. So, and there were some cases where they wrote, I maybe shouldn't write this, but I don't think any other eyes will see it. You know, things like that. But, you know, it outlasted them. So, okay, go ahead. And then the lady in the white
I have a question for Craig. Now that your reunion's coming up for your Belgian Antwerp mission, have you talked to any of the missionaries regarding the people in the book? Do they recognize the people in the book?
Oh yeah, a few of them have written me, and I was glad they really liked it because I wasn't sure. But they all figured out who's who. But the mission president he asked me to talk on this Thursday at our reunion about how being a European historian has influenced my view of Belgium and Flanders, you know, because that's where we all were on a mission. And I said, I'd be glad to do that, but you know, I just finished a book that was more directly about our mission, and I'd be glad to talk about that. And he said, well, my wife and I have been looking at that, but we think we want you to talk about the other. So I don't know how much he likes it or not, but the missionaries, there wasn't anything really scandalous about him or bad, I thought, but it's probably not the, you know, he's kind of the guy who held up the ideal as the reality, and so any admission that you couldn't do it was an admission of lack of faith or something rather than, you know,
I just would, I don't know, I just want to add this comment that Craig has always been very supportive of my writing, and his book that he's written about his mission is at the height of his writing powers. He is an amazing writer. Like, it really made me feel like he could write a really good novel. But I still teach college writing, and I can open to any page. If you pick up his book, you open to any page. It is beautifully written and beautifully described, and I've used it as an example in my writing classes recently, actually. So.
Thanks. She owed me, so.
I do owe him. It's right here in the middle.
I was interested in what your resources were, the sources for the diaries and the autobiographies. You mentioned the WBA for the one, but how did you go about finding these writings?
In the church archives, the LDS Church Archives, and Daughters of Utah Pioneers has a really good collection, and special collections at the BYU Library and Utah State Historical Society.
So the families have
And
made available,
yeah,
and they've been kept in libraries and so forth.
right. They gave the manuscripts over, and actually, in one case, a family gave me their great-great-grandmother's autobiography because they thought I would be interested in it. Yes?
Did you trace these women's lives after the manifesto and what their reaction was at that time?
Yes, I think there were about 14 of them who would have been writing during that period, and I was surprised. That was another thing I was surprised about from that period, that they didn't seem to mourn the manifesto. They may have felt that it was inevitable. They may have been, they also may have realized by the time they wrote that their lives were still pretty much going to go on. Most of them ended up continuing to have children with their husbands. But I was surprised. I thought that they would have complained more about the manifesto, and I really didn't find very much of that.
I have a question for Craig. If I remember right, your mission was one of the lowest baptizing missions in Europe at the time.
Probably in history.
And I think at the same time, we were about the same time. Our mission for a while, I don't remember whether it was for a month or for a 6-month period or for a year, we were the highest baptizing mission in Europe, not counting England. They had, their numbers were off the charts compared to ours. So what did they do in your mission? I know that they gave us an insane amount of hours to turn around and work to push for this goal and do that. Did you have, when you're in a mission where the baptism rate is really low, what did they do in your mission to turn around and motivate you when it looked like it was bleak and
Right.
hopeless?
Well, I write about this. You have a few choices. One is you can, and the most common maybe, and what I tried really hard to do, was you try to figure out what you're doing wrong. So you figure something's wrong with you. And you look inside yourself and you keep trying to fix things. And, you know, it's not a bad thing to have to look inside and admit you have some flaws. But you could take that forever, you know. I mean, even in Mormon doctrine, you know, there's the idea that there's always something wrong. You know, King Benjamin, we're all unprofitable servants, you know, at some point. So you could do that. Or you could lose faith altogether, and maybe some did. Or you can try to reconcile the dream and the reality, right? Where you kind of privately say, okay, I can't do this, but I can do this. And that's kind of, you do that when you're desperate, because you don't want to lose your faith, you know, but you got to change the ideal, or you'll go crazy. But most of the time, I think most of my mission I spent trying to, you know, just conform to the ideal. And so we had a checklist of 113 points that I talk about in the book, of 113 points of spirituality, including, do you pay your bills on time? I never realized this was a big point of spirituality. So 113 points, and the implication was if you weren't doing these always, you know, because there was always, sometimes, and never for the checks that you put. If you weren't doing all of these, the implication was, well, there you go. You know, there's your problem. So that was the reaction. Yeah, you tried harder, and that, again, isn't necessarily bad, but at what point does it become unhealthy almost and start leading to things like, you know, bad dreams? But again, I mean, there were so many good things I got too. What the problem was, it took me a long time to realize to just accept the whole package. You know, instead of pretending that I only got good things and they cancel out all the difficult things. When I was able to write the book, it was because I kind of accepted the whole thing. just was all part of it.
Did you ever think of maybe putting together baseball teams?
That was kind of outlawed. That was kind of outlawed in the 70s because of all the abuses. But in fact, many members there wished that there were more cultural. There were all these singing missionaries, and the sports teams and things like that they felt they really liked. So but we couldn't do that kind of stuff anymore. I mean, when I read about what went before, and then our daughter was on a mission in France, a few years ago. It's just so different. I mean, the 70s were the hardcore, I think. I mean, from what I can tell. I mean, you gave all these perfectly memorized discussions. You worked from 9:30 to 9:30. I mean, and I'm not saying I walked 5 miles to school in the snow, that kind of thing. I mean, just historically looking at it, I'm saying, man, it was too much, And some of the things my daughter told me about her mission in France were things I wish would have changed, and they have. So I think people are seeing that. Might need a little more time for language study and so on. Such long hours.
Craig, I wrote down what you said about the ideals versus the practice or the reality, and yet that's what I gather from your book, Paula, because you intimate that the women never questioned the ideal of polygamy. They believed it was from Joseph Smith, it was a prophecy from Joseph Smith that they should live it. But the practice of it, the reality of it, they didn't have instruction on how to make it work. And that's why it was so lamentable and so hard for the women, particularly the women.
Yeah, it's interesting to see them kind of bashing up against a cultural ideal, a tradition that for centuries, the idea of monogamous marriage, and so they're just constantly trying to reconcile where they are with what they just is sort of in their DNA, I guess you could say. And I found out from that change is not easy, and I think we all know that if you even want to change a little thing in your own marriage, how difficult it is to change your thinking. And imagine the hurdle that they had to get over to try to change their thinking to a polygamous mindset. And they were also overwhelmingly still living in a culture that was monogamous too, because it was a smaller percentage of people who were living polygamy.
Okay, is that it? Let's give them another hand.
Thank you so much for inviting me.